Hola a totes i a tots. Benvinguts a la taula inaugural de l'11a edició de la Fira Literal, una fira que enguany posa la mirada a la necessitat d'imaginar i crear històries de futurs que ens emocionin per fer front a la por i a la resignació. Avui tenim el gran plaer de compartir aquesta taula inaugural amb Lola Olufemi. Per qui no la conegui, faré una breu introducció de qui és. La doctora Lola Olufemi és una escriptora feminista negra, membre de la London Feminist Library. Els seus textos han estat publicats en revistes i diaris nacionals i internacionals d'arreu del món. Va cursar estudis anglesos al Selwyn College de Cambridge, on va ser la delegada de la Cambridge University Students' Union i una de les facilitadores de FLY, la xarxa universitària per a dones i persones no binàries negres. Ha participat en nombrosos esdeveniments i trobades sobre feminisme i descolonització arreu del país i va ser membre de la NUS Women's Campaign i del Comitè Executiu Nacional de la NUS. Ha escrit i parlat sobre nombrosos temes com l'art i la cultura, el feminisme, el gènere i el sexisme, la justícia climàtica i la raça, el racisme, l'assetjament sexual a les universitats, la justícia institucional i les pràctiques descolonitzadores en l'educació. És autora de les obres Feminisme interromput, Rebentar el poder, editat per Raig Verd el 2023, i Experiments per imaginar altrament, també editat per Raig Verd 2025, i coautora de A Fly Girl's Guide to University, Being a Woman of Color at Cambridge and Other Institutions of Power and Elitism. Actualment s'acaba de doctorar a la Universitat de Westminster gràcies a una beca de la universitat i la Fundació Stuart Hall. Com estàs, Lola?
Thank you so much for having me, and bon dia. Yeah, if it's a bit slow, sorry because of the translation, but thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so happy to be in conversation with you.
Moltes gràcies. La veritat és que és un plaer poder tenir-te aquí després d'haver-te llegit, no? I que siguis la persona que inaugura la Fira Literal és un gran plaer. Per començar, avui la nostra taula s'anomena Futurs en disputa, reescriure el món que vindrà, i parlarem sobre el paper de la imaginació i les narratives utòpiques com a eines radicals de resistència i transformació, necessàries per desafiar les visions establertes sobre el futur, desmuntar allò que sembla immòbil i obrir escletxes a altres mons possibles. A la teva obra, sobretot a l'últim llibre, defenses una postura molt contundent i contagiosa a favor de la imaginació i del poder de la ficció per fer front al context desolador que estem vivint i on tot ens diu que estem dirigint-nos cap al col·lapse. Per qui encara no hagi tingut el plaer de llegir-te, ens podries explicar una mica per què i com vas arribar a aquesta postura tan radical?
So for me, the experiments in imagining otherwise kind of emerge from the context of trying to understand the emotional resonances of neoliberalism. Basically, how is in the UK the structure of neoliberalism, this kind of system, the decimation of infrastructures of social care, the kind of concentration of wealth upwards, and the privatization and the securitization of everyday life, what emotional environment or landscape does that build for people? And I think inside of this like crisis conjuncture that we find ourselves in, that has been brought on in some sense by neoliberalism, one of the key kind of ways that people experience the effective landscape is through the notion of despair, or through the notion of like a kind of stuckness or an inaction, a pessimism. And I was really interested in the role that culture, aesthetic practices play in trying to move people through that feeling of despair, but also build, you know, in the way that Raymond Williams describes, like a new structure of feeling, a new way of inaugurating our sense of the world, a new attempt to create a sense perception against the kind of ideological strictures of neoliberalism. And that's where, yeah, that's where the heart and the spirit of the book lies, an attempt through poetics and through fragmentation, through a rejection of totality, a rejection of kind of like total solutions, to bring an audience into a collaborative moment of thinking about what is to be done in this point in history. And a lot of my research, just in general, tries to critique this idea that this idea of linear temporality, the idea that time kind of moves in one direction from A to B, a kind of stadial and progressive understanding of history and event. And through poetics, I'm trying to rearrange temporality or argue that our historiographical practices, our ways of understanding past events, do us a disservice. And it tries to use poetics, I guess, to touch the past, to act as if past, present, and future were contemporaneous, were not kind of rigidly separated temporal regimes. And in doing that, I think it's trying to make this argument that temporality is merely like the experience of human duration, and that experience can be organized in different ways. It can be organized by large collectives of people, and is constantly being reorganized through forms of collective action, grassroots struggle across the world. So I wanted to really return to this sense that culture plays some role in the production of social life, and that our cultural and aesthetic practices are part of an ideological war that we are in, as well as a material one, in some sense.
La lectura del segon llibre, i parlo com a lectora, és molt esperançadora, i a més en un context en què, el que comentava abans, no? Tot ens està portant a aquesta idea d'un futur que serà distòpic. D'on creus que neix, quines creus que són les causes d'aquesta por i d'aquesta desesperació i una mica també d'aquest nihilisme que està rampant, no? entre la societat avui en dia?
I think it has something to do with our conception of temporality, as I said. It has something to do with our sense that, we're merely moving in one direction, and then if you are somebody with a capacious or liberatory vision of social life, you constantly find yourself on the losing end, or on the side of the defeated. And I like to think that we as communist Marxists, as people who have liberatory social visions, we belong to a history of the defeated, but that needn't be something that locks us into place. That failure is also a site of experimentation. It's a site through which we can collectively gather to, again, think about this question of what is to be done. But it's also a rejection of the sense that our job is to win in the game of history. I think, historicizing is incredibly important to our political project, but I think that there are ways that a kind of fidelity to a very progressive and stadial conception of history locks us into a position where we're constantly in the kind of like mode of critique. And I'm not arguing for any kind of premature celebration, but I am saying in playing with temporality in the aesthetic realm, that gives us some flexibility for our material and strategic practices as well. So a lot of my work looks at the archival material of radical social movements and tries to conceptualize those forms of cultural production as artistic objects, in order to give political subjects back some autonomy, to say that when we engage with these materials, their aesthetic, presentation, the way that a pamphlet is phrased, what it says, the way that a poster is made up, can give us some sense of what to do in the present. It contains within it some form of knowledge that is useful to us and shouldn't merely be dismissed to the realm of kind of like emotion or affect. These documents, I think, when we engage with them creatively, they have material effects in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. My attempt through creative practice to reject the terms of the present or reject the given. It is not a new one. It's something that has existed throughout the history of radical social movements. I'm thinking of Amilcar Cabral when he says that culture is always the kind of open or closed sense of a society, and the decision to open and close, or the decision to produce materials that honor our relationships to each other, our relationships of solidarity, our relationships of our relationships that tried to, produce freedom. That is the task of any kind of artist. It's the task of anybody who's interested in truly producing a radical form of cultural production, I think.
Abans esmentaves el terme arxiu, que és un concepte que utilitzes molt a la teva obra i que defineixes com una invenció colonial en l'àmbit de la consciència narrativa que ens ha convençut que el temps assenyala un moviment cap endavant, un moviment determinat a partir del qual els esdeveniments es poden regular, preveure i anticipar. I cites a Hall i dius l'arxiu representa el final d'un tipus d'innocència creativa. També comentaves que, clar, molts cops no som subjectes de la història, no? No som ni personatges secundaris dins la història. Segons tu, com creus que podem combatre amb aquesta narrativa hegemònica que no ens inclou?
I think that I also take from Hall this idea that culture is this battleground of interpretive struggle, that we we have some autonomy in the way that we understand and produce social life. And I think what I was trying to get at with the archive is that so often state archives are places of management, regulation, the management and regulation of history, the presentation of history in terms of certain rhythms and temporalities, the collapsing of events. These are all things that often specific, like racialized political subjects are tasked with kind of like filling in the gaps or attempting to rewrite the grand narrative. And in breaking away from that imperative, I think we give us back our freedom to refocus on the very material relationship between how we feel, what we make, and what we do. And I think that ultimately is the basis of my work. So I have, in the research that I was doing, I was thinking about creating quite an ambivalent posture towards the archive, to say the archive is not, a space of total truth. It's also that site of contestation. And in trying to free material from the archive, in trying to make cultural production free at the point of use, to take it outside into communities, that's a way that I and others attempt to build a critical consciousness within like working class people, within people who have the same kind of liberatory goals and ambitions as we do. So for me, like, critiques of the archive or an explanation of the imagination never happens on an individual or abstracted level. For me, like, individual creative expression is always already social because it already exists in an environment of where freedoms are produced and unproduced, where money circulates, where dispossession happens in the social world. So in some sense, we are always either creating things that demonstrate our fidelity to others or our connection and interdependence and relation to others, or we're not. And that's a huge kind of driving force in how like I approach not only the individual process of writing, but what the archive comes to mean, because archives can exist kind of anywhere. And yes, they have been tools of colonial invention, state regulation, but they can also be the opposite. We can build different kinds of networks and build different kind of routes for information to flow in and through. I think that that's super important.
Sí, de fet, un dels experiments que fas al llibre és invitar el lector a participar de l'escriptura del llibre, perquè dius que és un document viu. Ens pots explicar una mica per què, creus que el futur es fa de forma col·lectiva, que l'arxiu es construirà de forma col·lectiva, col·laborant?
I think that my kind of conception of the imagination, which is kind of central to this book, and my sense of futurity, they're both collective and relational. So the imagination has, historically been kind of conceptualized as a private experience of sublime beauty. And in trying to break it out, in trying to make it collective and relational, and in a sense, like, dependent on the actions of other people, I think what I'm trying to argue is that there is no sense of the future that, again, is individual. Our sense of the future is created together, but it also must require us to embrace what cannot be foreseen, what cannot be known. It requires us to embrace, in some sense, forms of contingency. And I think of the embrace of contingency as not incompatible with strategy or not incompatible with having a sense of what we're going to do, but I see it as a kind of method against neoliberal governmentality, which is all about prediction, which is all about data markers, which is all about the management and tracking of bodies across borders, in prisons, in other spaces where freedom is withheld or restricted. And so against that kind of capitalistic logic, I guess, and against this idea of property, which I think, property ownership, which is, I think, a core part of a capitalist ethos, creating, rejecting that in favor of embracing what comes next, embracing, modes of rehearsal, embracing a sense that the future will not arrive to us as a total closed entity. It's always an opening. There's always, space for contestation. That, to me, is my approach, and that's why so much of the book it feels collaborative, or is intended to feel collaborative. It's intended to feel like an invitation to the audience to think with me, alongside me. It's intended to kind of break down this hierarchy between reader and writer, to say that these are questions that we have to answer together.
Em sembla molt interessant això que comentes de que hem de poder abraçar o sigui, la contingència, no? Lo desconegut sobre el futur, una mica anant en contracorrent d'aquest desig de tenir-ho tot planejat que té la corrent neoliberalista. A la 10a edició de la Fira Literal, l'Àngela Davis ens deia que l'esperança no és simplement una emoció, sinó una disciplina, i que generar-la és també responsabilitat nostra. Aquesta idea em ressonava molt amb un concepte que esmentes molt a la teva obra, que és el del poder del desig, no? El poder del desig i del somni per invocar el futur. Més enllà de la sensació, del sentiment, creus que ens ha de catapultar a l'acció, ens ha de fer passar a l'acció?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there are ways that within a liberal mainstream, ideas of hope and ideas of dreaming can become very abstracted from material process. And so much of how I'm trying to conceptualize the power of poetics is very much rooted in, communist traditions, the history of communist traditions. I'm thinking about, like, for example, the poetic practices of the Sandinistas, or the poetic practices of anti-colonial resistance movements, the invocation of a future that was backed by strategic, repeated forms of like militant and non-militant action. I never want my invocation of dreaming to be locked inside of an individual body. And on the question of hope, I think so much of the inaction that I spoke about earlier, or so much of the feeling of stuckness, the feeling that we cannot make meaningful political interventions in the spaces that we're in, comes, I think, from the invocation to either the binary of either hope and despair, and in a very kind of like Gramscian mode, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Like that's where I kind of sit. So I'm interested in something that is more robust than the imperative to simply hope. I'm interested in the creation of forms of political determination in subjects. And I think that engagement with cultural production has plays some part in producing the desires, structures of feelings, frameworks that people can draw on that help to sustain their engagement in forms of resistance, whether that be like local or global. And we see that in the history of radical like social movements. I'm thinking about Barbara Harlow and the way she talks about Ghassan Kanafani's kind of the creation of the idea of resistance literature as a means of responding to the way that colonial endeavors erase a people's culture, but also as a means of responding to the betrayal of the native informant. So like thinking about the ways that specific individuals continue on, or do the work of colonial states and nations, and resistance literature as, culture as an as one arm of the fight against imperialism, for him emerges out of those two poles, out of the need to really understand that there has to be, as well as a political front, an economic front, that there also has to be a cultural front. And for me, those methods and those modes require from the people who take them on or put them forward something much sturdier than simply hope in the abstract. There's something about a sustained and repetitive process of action. Maybe we call it a new temporality, maybe we call it a new rhythm, maybe we call it determination. But yeah, I'm interested in what liberalism has done to the concept of hope. It's not a hollow or like useless idea, but so often it's divorced from what we do.
En aquest sentit, bueno, una de les frases que a mi em va ressonar molt és quan dius el pensament imaginatiu és un bon combustible. I en parles fins i tot en termes de conjura o, com deies abans, en termes d'invocació poètica. No? Com podem traslladar lo material al pensament imaginatiu?
Sorry, say that last bit again.
Com podem traslladar a quelcom material al pensament imaginatiu?
I think for me, this question is about the relationship between our imaginative thinking and material action.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so I think, maybe to begin with a kind of concrete example, I look at the work of the Organization of Women of Asian and African Descent and the Brixton Black Women's Group in the UK, which were both black feminist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, socialist, communist formations. And a lot of the material that they produced were like pamphlets and newsletters that were dispersed to working class communities at a very low cost, basically. And they spoke about housing, they spoke about education, they spoke about anti-colonial struggle and their understanding of themselves as workers inside of a global imperialist system. But they also included in those pamphlets and posters poems, invocations for the futures, their sense of themselves as quote-unquote post-colonial subjects positioned in Britain. And I think the studying of those documents, i.e. the studying of the poetry, the studying of the pictures, the studying of the kinds of information that these groups put together and who they circulated it for and how they circulated it can tell us something, for example, about the necessity in the present moment of maintaining our relationships to anti-colonial solidarity, even though the terrain in the last 20 years under neoliberalism has shifted so much. The surveillance apparatus has grown. It's now monstrous, But that's a core principle that we can take from them. We can also take, for example, in their critiques of the sus laws, which were precursors to stop and search laws in the UK. We can take from them a kind of an early abolitionist form or relationship to understanding policing, prisons, which is being expressed now through a younger generation of feminist thinkers in the UK. So for me, the changing the imaginative into the material is a process of study. It's a process of really understanding what strategic principles can we pull from these documents and how do we understand the imagination. For me, the imagination is simply a process of bringing that which does not exist into being. And that exists on multiple fronts. It can exist in a kind of local sense. It can exist in terms of culture and the things that we make as artists, as writers, etc. But yeah, that to me is the fundamental link. And I hope if people take anything away from this, that there isn't a sense of this abstraction of the imagination, that the imagination is always, that it's meaningless without it being connected to intervention.
100%. Els límits estructurals d'aquest món restringeixen la nostra capacitat d'articular tot el que la imaginació pot concebre. La manera com estan organitzades les societats, una cosa que comentes, no? El disseny de les cases i l'urbanisme ens limita en un sistema que sobreposa el capital per sobre de tot. Creus que la imaginació i la manera com vivim està limitada?
Yeah, so I think about, in a capitalist society, the ways that our labor is stratified, the very specific ways that we are exploited, the imperative to exchange labor for a wage, all of the ways that that steals our time, our ability to be with each other in transformative and meaningful ways, our sense of each other, and the profound alienation that process of labor exploitation creates in individuals, right? Like, I know best the British context, but I'm thinking about Margaret Thatcher's notion that there is no such thing as society. There's only individuals, and the way that has seeped so much into the way that seeped and changed, I think, the British psyche is very interesting because it's closed down possibility at so many junctures, meaning for perhaps the average person, but what does that mean? It's near impossible to imagine meaningful relationships with neighbors, with someone who isn't in your kind of immediate family. And so the bit that you're quoting from the book is from a quote from June Jordan in Civil Wars, where she's talking about the relationship between architectonic reality and our sense of being. And she was someone who very astutely picked up on in I kind of take this from her attempt. Her and Buckminster Fuller, who was an architect, they did this joint project called Skyrise for Harlem, where they tried to redesign Harlem after the murder of James Powell, who was a black man, a young black boy actually. And in doing that, I think that was a prime example of June Jordan's ability to understand that the containment, the caging of people and their sense of possibility under capitalism was not only expressed in where and how labor was produced, but also in the very texture of everyday life, in the way that buildings were made, in the ways that people express their relationships within those buildings, in the surveillance that was kind of built into the way we live. And so from that kind of principle, I take this idea that, to answer the question very simply, yes, that capitalism obviously shapes the way that we live. And if we think about the present moment, so much of our sense of, again, possibility or, social vision or whatever is being shaped by new algorithmic means of containment and regulation. So we're thinking about predictive policing, for example, thinking about, AI being used to track down militants, thinking about AI being used to predict people's movements across the border. That shapes our sense of what we can demand and how we can ask for it. And again, one way that we exercise that desire, one way that we keep and exercise our emotional attachments to opening the world rather than imposing a closure on it, is in art, is in artistic practice,
Moltes gràcies per aquesta explicació, ha estat molt interessant. Una de les maneres com imagines el futur a la teva obra és a través de la ficció. De fet, els fragments en què expliques, diguéssim, aquest món més utòpic són relats de ficció, no? que passen una mica per un món distòpic. En aquest sentit, creus que la ficció és el que ens salvarà?
No. No, not at all. But I think that it is a site where, again, that rehearsal takes place. It is a site where we get to practice what we're constantly being told is not actionable. And even if, the artistic process is in and of itself already a failure because it maybe doesn't, in the moment that we're reading something, maybe it doesn't produce a material effect. It is producing a change in an emotional landscape which is connected to our impetus to resist. So in very simply, like, not allowing the world to crush your sense your sense perception, and rejecting the alienating, most isolating elements of capital, how it infects yourself, your relationships with the world and society. That is a practice. That is a discipline, and we can call that hoping. We can call it many different things. But for me, fiction is when I was writing those bits in the book, I was not really thinking about utopia necessarily. Like, I wouldn't even call the states of what I describe utopia. I'm describing the moment post a revolution, or the moment when all of these structures that seem impenetrable, the prison, the police, crumble, in some sense. And what does it mean then to walk through the ruins of that, knowing that these ruins are, as I say in the book, embers that can be reconstructed? And what does it mean to give people back that sense of flexibility in terms of those states, basically? So yeah, no, I'm not somebody who believes ultimately in the role of the artist. I think, the role of the artist is to look around and see what everyone else is doing and make some propaganda, actually. That's what I think artists should be doing. Like, align yourself with grassroots movements, interventions, and create through your beautiful artistic skills some propaganda for those movements that can build critical consciousness. That's what I think of myself doing when I am talking about the imagination, or I'm talking about poetics, or I'm talking about, register, rhyme, meter, all of these things. I'm trying to create in parallel a space to think about what we want, whilst what we want is also being fought for. And hopefully those two things meet at some point.
Abans comentaves que, clar, aquests personatges en aquestes parts de ficció que escrius estan passejant per les ruïnes, no, del que ha passat després de la revolució. I un concepte que esmentes molt també en aquests formats més poètics és l'amor revolucionari. En aquest sentit, creus que l'amor revolucionari i els efectes és el que ens permetrà passar del moment que no podrem escapar de la revolució cap a un futur millor?
I think they play a key strategic role in them, in the creation of that future. And I think about this thing constantly that Tina Camp said about care being the inability to look past another person's precarity. And I think also about this idea from Sophie Lewis about, hazarding, they say, I will try and hazard a definition of love. To love someone is to struggle for their autonomy, in as much as that is possible in a world choked by capital. That's what Sophie says, and those to me are two very beautiful and astute understandings of what love should be, against ideas of like romantic love, against love that is privatized by all of the goings on in the nuclear family. Really opening, we've not yet touched 1/10 of our capacity for love, because we are not all constantly engaged in the struggle for another's autonomy. And when we do struggle for another's autonomy, when we live up to the ethical responsibility in relationships that forms of feminist thought, forms of anti-colonial, anti-racist strategic principles enable us to do, then we begin to approach what love means as an ethic, as a responsibility, as a task, as an action, rather than as a passive state of attachment to a specific idea or experience. To move love out of the realm of the experiential towards the realm of solid, relational commitment, I guess, or action, I think is the huge task of anybody who is interested in trying to conceptualize human life and the process of meeting human needs collectively in a different way.
M'agrada que esmentis l'amor més enllà d'una experiència, com una acció, no? que t'animi a prendre partit per la persona que estimes. A Feminisme Interromput assegures que hi ha un altre món possible, que és possible un futur millor, però creus que està a l'abast de tothom?
At everyone's scope?
Sí,
Oh,
si aquest món possible, creus que tothom hi pot accedir? Està sempre o sigui, podrà estar a
oh,
l'abast de
in
tothom?
everyone's reach.
Exacte.
Sorry. No, that's okay. Yes, in some sense, I think that everybody. I think for me and the groups that I belong to, one of the hardest things about thinking through this particular historical conjuncture is that we have to attempt to envision modes of social relation that include everyone. And that's difficult. That's difficult in a world where you have enemies. It's difficult for lots of different reasons. And we have to ask ourselves very hard questions about disposability. We have to ask ourselves hard questions about functionally and practically how will this world that we envisage operate? How will water be organized? How will food be organized? Education, housing, all of these things. And thinking long and hard about that produces its own set of contradictions all the time. But, you know, as good Marxists, we are able to sit in contradiction and we're able to really understand that it's one of the primary modes of engaging with the social world. And so, yeah, I mean, the question of accessibility to the future that we want to build, everyone is invited. Of course, nobody is purposefully excluded. But I think that that's where, you know, the abstract feeling, desire states of the imagination have to then become grounded in some kind of political program, you know, some kind of structure. Like I think structure is useful in attempting to organize people and relations. But the question becomes, what is that structure? How do we operate it collectively? Which are all questions that are already being answered in lots of global contexts. I think sometimes when we have these kinds of conversations, it's hard, it becomes, and in a moment where the border is being so securitized, our sense of what is happening globally across the world it becomes kind of pin-sized, and we're very trapped inside of the kind of imperial core. And I think about, you know, the resistance committees in Sudan. I think about people keeping other people alive in the midst of a counter-revolutionary war. I think about the resonances and impacts of, you know, revolution, sustaining revolution. And that means feeding people, educating people, making sure people are able to protect themselves. Whole communities of people, you know, did that. And then who are we to then close down our sense of possibility or our sense of what is happening? Or I think about, you know, the Bangladeshi garment workers who went on strike, you know, a few years ago and shut down the country. Like there are ways that our sense perception is so there are ways that it's limited by, you know, the circulation of news and information, and really keeping yourself in tune with what workers across the world are doing, what unions are doing, what is happening across, you know, borders is incredibly important. And which is why also, you know, there is always an overrepresentation of American feminisms and American hegemony in our conceptualizations of feminism, which is why it's so important, I think, to really understand and study those feminist movements Black feminist movements in the UK, in Spain, like, and we find often, you know, so many similarities between what Black feminists in Spain are theorizing and what they're theorizing in the UK, because the border operations are very much the same also. And so, yeah, being able to have, yes, a global outlook and to remember that the world is not just the community you live in. It's much broader, and that the kind of capacious visions that seem impossible to you are constantly happening across the world also renews and reanimates our sense of everyday life.
M'agrada molt que hagis esmentat els exemples de lluita i resistència que actualment tenen lloc arreu del món, perquè una de les coses que comentes a la teva obra sobre el futur és que el futur és plural. El futur és ara, és a tot arreu al mateix temps, és multidireccional. Potser la clau per fer front a aquesta por i a aquest desassossec és no imaginar el futur com una cosa que està lluny i que està endavant, sinó com una cosa que tenim ara mateix.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of understanding it, to say that we are actively involved in how the future is created, and that the future doesn't, like I said before, arrive to us total, but that everything we do now is already a precursor for that future coming into being, and that we're also capable of intervening in the past. That the past is not finished, it's not closed. You know, we're living in its aftermath in some way. That aftermath has some relationship to shaping future sense. But for me, futurity is always a question, and it always comes back to actually the question that has preoccupied radical movements across centuries, which is, how do we actually meet human need? And that question has echoes, it has resonances. And I think that what you find in forms of cultural production over time, some people call it, some people think it's a depressing thing that you see echoes or resonances, or you see the same demands 20 or 30 years later. But actually, when I see that, I see myself as positioned in a radical legacy. I see myself as the beneficiary of forms of struggle to which I am being inducted into, and I will induct someone else, not only in the present, but in the future as well. Resisting this idea that there will be a final win, and that there will come a time when nothing has to be done, where labor ceases. I think is unproductive. I don't think is useful, because it's not about the secession of labor. Like, I belong to an anti-work arts collective, and we're constantly critiquing labor, but it's not about the secession of labor. It's about laboring in a different way, laboring for love, laboring for pleasure, laboring for artistic process, for the production of affects that can sustain human relationships. So that's what I'll say about that.
Hem estat parlant molt sobre el futur i com arribar al futur i la manera com podem utilitzar la imaginació i el pensament per arribar a aquest futur, però m'agradaria preguntar-te com t'imagines tu aquest futur. Sé que no utilitzes la paraula utopia, però si ens poguessis resumir una mica les idees que apareixen al llibre, a les parts de ficció, sobre les característiques d'aquesta societat futura per al nostre públic.
The key components of the future. Well, I don't think I can. I think for me, that future necessarily obviously involves the end of capitalism. And the end of capitalism means the ends of so many kinds of catastrophes, big or small, ecological, monetary, etc. And that also has some impact on, geopolitical relations, all of these things. But for me, when I think about the future in this sense, I don't want to provide a kind of, here's what it will be. But I can speak to its affect. I can speak to, the idea that we won't experience the kinds of mental, physical, psychological exhaustion, the kinds of violence that we preempt when we go outside, when we wake up, when we go onto the street, that we won't assume that, human nature is somehow driven towards greed, violence, disgust, or we won't preempt another's ability to harm you. And I think that is something that is overlooked in terms of how much it currently organizes all of our psychological and social relationships. We'll also have enough resource, plenty. There'll be food, housing, shelter. We will have rearranged the home and the family so that exploitation does not occur inside of that bounded family unit. We'll have kinship structures that we are unable to currently conceive of, where every single child is ours, where every child is our responsibility, whether we have one or we don't have one. I mean, I could go on and go on and go on, but I think the point is that, for me, we see glimpses of all of those political projects from, the Marxist materialist, the family abolitionist, the social reproductionist. There are all of these ways that what I take from feminism actually as a method is the plurality of strategies and the plurality of methods that we can use to attack any systems of dispossession wherever we are, and those systems in their operation, for example, are geographically contingent. The way the state operates in present-day Nigeria is not the same way that it operates in the UK. And as people with similar visions, we have to be attentive to that. And we see that in, for example, movements for abolition, how the NSARS movement in Nigeria spoke specifically to militarized police in that concept, in that geographical context. And abolitionist movements in the UK are doing the same, thinking specifically about how the British prison operates in relation to others, not just applying a one-size-fits-all approach to that political project. And I think those things they buoy me, they reanimate me whenever I am tempted to go into places of despair. I only have to go and speak to another person, an artist, somebody who I know is inside of the vision with me, to remember what it is that I am attached to. Yeah.
Mentre les finestres de futur que veiem a través de la teva obra són molt inspiradores i, de fet, aquesta esperança i aquest desig d'un futur millor és bastant contagiós. Creus que la teva obra i la teva visió del futur s'inscriu en una nova corrent que s'allunyarà una mica del nihilisme i d'aquestes obres que ens diuen que no tenim un futur i que no arribarem a un futur millor?
Well, yeah, I mean, but I think that tradition has been long-standing against kind of the idea of accelerationism, moving, through crisis and catastrophe as fast as we can, and also against this idea that the present moment is somehow that history has ended. I think I'm what you get from the feminist tradition and what you get from, I think, a lot of communist traditions is this insistence on continuing, this insistence that our projects are open-ended, are flexible, continue on, that our projects don't end in a catastrophic historical moment, that they change, that they maybe become more or less useful, but that nothing is lost fundamentally. I think that that's something also I take from my approach to archives is that, becoming really, developing a relationship to history means developing relationships to ephemera that you cannot grasp in their totality. And once you exercise the letting go, the letting things kind of slip through your fingers as a kind of ethical posture or a way of being in the world, then it becomes much easier to contend with history. And it becomes much easier not to get too attached to your painful sense of loss or your individual sense of despair,
Una mica per anar acabant, sobretot de cara a la gent que no t'hagi llegit, què és el que li diries al públic per sortir i escapar una mica de la desesperança del present actual, i quin tipus d'actes i accions individuals o col·lectives creus que podem prendre per fer front al present?
I think that those actions are already taking place, or are already taking place in Spain, in the creation of like migrant networks of care that are stopping the murder of people for moving between borders. They're already taking place in abolitionist kind of organizations and in Black feminist organizations, which are redefining subjecthood, are redefining their sense of like what it means to be part of Spain, be a racialized subject in Spain, in Catalan, and are making, I think of something like the Mawazi Collective actually in France, who are Afro-French, Black Marxist feminists, whose demands very much come from an understanding of the racialized stratification of labor in France. So they're making demands from the positions of Black women workers who are like cleaners, for example, who work in the inner city. That's their beginning point for understanding labor, race, all of these different things. And without naming all of them, that's happening in Europe, it's happening in Spain, that whenever you feel as if, there isn't, where is our equivalent of X, you either begin it or it's already there and you have to work to go and find it. And yeah, for me, I want to come back, I guess, to this idea that like culture can be one route through which you offer out a hand to find another person. And historically, it has been that. I'm writing I'm working on a new project which is about a critique of the conservatism of Anglophone literary cultures. And I'm finding throughout history, whether it's the writing practices of the Sandinistas or the Afro-Asian Writers' Conference in 1958, or I'm finding that there are so many instances where, or like Black feminist reading circles in the UK, there are so many instances where people who are engaged in political struggle meet outside of the realm of quote unquote politics to understand culture as a means through which they also do their work, and they also do the political struggle continues, and that they write poems on the side as a way of reanimating everyday life, giving back that texture to everyday life as a practice that sustains them and keeps them going. I think about someone like Claudia Jones, for example, who was a prolific poet, and so many of her poems are about connections to comrades. She has this poem called Antifascista, which she wrote for Blanca Canales, which actually opens the book. And maybe I can read it to close, but I guess it's not in English. But she kind of says something like, I knew you long before our common ties of conscious choice broke over single skies. Those of us who, fused by our mold, became their targets as of old, or something like that. I mean, it was I got a bit of it wrong, but I think that for me, like that poetic and political promise is one part of like answering the question, what do we do? We provide this material that we come back to, that sustains us, that keeps us going, whilst we also, gather in the same space or in a different space to ask, what are the agents of dispossession in our local environment? How do we begin to make demands collectively? And we keep doing that, unfortunately, until we die. That's really for me, the response to this question of, what is to be done. And history will move around us, it will change, but we know what we are attached to. And our job is to remain attached to those principles, those ideas, in a world that is trying to separate us through alienation from what those principles are.
Lola, moltíssimes gràcies. Aquesta reflexió final de la Clàudia Jones m'ha semblat superadient per tancar la taula d'avui. Marxem amb ganes de prendre acció i de pensar que el futur és ara, no? I que no està lluny. Moltíssimes gràcies per presentar la taula inaugural de la Fira Literal. Espero que hagis estat a gust. I moltíssimes gràcies a tothom que ha vingut avui a escoltar-nos. Qualsevol cosa, estem aquí.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your generous and thoughtful questions. Thank you to the festival as well.
Busca. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de començar a esbrinar. És aquí on el llibre també persones des de canvi que projecten idees, que dialoguen entre si per transformar radicalment la societat. Transformació i aprenentatge. Busquem preguntes diferents, altres som la població la que hem de